Hello, everybody. I hope you hear me. Excellent. So it's my pleasure to introduce you Professor Jonathan Huppert, Professor of Psychology at the Hebrew University. His research interest is treatment of anxiety and its disorder, and he will tell us the best way to deal with panic in these times, very hard times. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much and welcome everyone. I guess it's hard and yet not hard to make time to think about anxiety in these trying times that we're having. I'd like to just try to give an introduction to what is stress and anxiety and panic, and then go through how we can try to cope with it in these trying times. So first of all, we can differentiate between panic and anxiety and stress. Panic is a acute response, usually to a threat, with a lot of a strong physiological arousal that it can actually really peak in a panic attack, which is a sudden rush of fear, intense discomfort, and with a lot of different signs that can be anything from heart racing, dizziness, fears of dying, passing out, or losing control. Anxiety tends to be a more future-oriented emotional reaction, often associated more with worry, and it's trying to prevent a more future-oriented threat, and it's less associated with a lot of sympathetic or autonomic arousal and more with muscle tension, irritability, lack of concentration, and difficulty with sleep. And stress, on the other hand, is how we deal with uncertainty or unknown, or also with overload when we have to try to make a decision between a lot of different types of stressors or different types of options that we have can also lead to stress. And stress can definitely also include a lot of physical tension. And the reason that I'm starting with defining these terms is because we can experience any of these in these trying times right now, that by being stuck in our houses and not able to go out, we can have panic, we can have anxiety, and we can have stress. Fortunately, actually, the ways to cope with these things are relatively similar, and so as I go through, I'll talk about how to deal with them. So another thing that's really important, I think, for me to emphasize today is that there's a really, what most of us experience nowadays in these times when we're potentially stuck in our houses without knowing exactly what's going to happen in the future in terms of the coronavirus, is that there's a real threat that the governments all around the world are responding to. And it's normal to feel these experiences of anxiety and stress, and it may even be normal to have some level of panic attack that can occur during those times. On the other hand, when our reactions to the responses are exaggerated, or when we're reacting to threats that aren't really there, then that's when we talk about pathological anxiety and stress and their disorders, the anxiety disorders and stress disorders. So when we think about the psychology of panic, anxiety, and stress, I think there's a few different things that are really important to keep in mind. First of all, these types of emotions, and all of our emotions, are actually ways of our body and the world communicating to ourselves and to others. Anxiety is actually one of the most basic emotions that we can think of in terms of what's the evolutionary function, right? It's there, we feel anxious in order to keep ourselves safe. It's when we notice a threat in our environment, the natural reaction, emotional reaction, is anxiety. That's what the fight or flight system is about. We tend to really feel more the desire to flee than to fight, right? The fight is more an anger reaction, which we can see also how that makes sense in these kind of times as well. So when we feel anxious, we both feel it internally, and when we also show signs that show to other people that there's also danger, and that helps the whole environment around us prepare for whatever threat or danger there is, at least when it's working adaptively. So when we think about an emotion like anxiety, then we can really break it down into three different parts. There are the thoughts associated with anxiety. Most of those thoughts are appraisals of threat, saying that maybe I'll get corona, or maybe there's corona in the environment that we're in right now. And that will lead to lots of physical sensations, which will include things like I had mentioned before, sensations such as heart racing, dry mouth, dizziness, or just muscle tension, and just feeling alert. And then there are behaviors that we engage in that usually those emotions are really leading us to act in one way. That's the fight or flight. One of the most natural responses to feeling anxiety is to try to flee, right? So if we see a lion, we'll feel all those things and then we'll try to run away. Now, those behaviors can be much more specific, and I'll get into what those behaviors are in today's age of corona. But just to kind of put that together, to also think about how panic can work, the same thing can happen within a panic attack, that there's some kind of trigger, which is maybe, oh no, maybe I just touched something or just came into contact with someone that has corona. And that can lead to your heart racing, which will lead to the thought, oh my gosh, what's happening to me? That can lead to you taking an action, like I better go lie down to be better, or to also isolate myself from the disease. And that can actually, instead of calming you, can lead to a vicious cycle and a spiral that can lead into a panic attack. Okay, so that's just a little basic about what the natural responses to threat are. So how do we cope in the age of corona, given that there is a pretty constant message right now going around us of a real threat to something that exists in terms of the coronavirus, and governments all around the world are responding to it in a very serious way in order to try to prevent it from becoming a catastrophe. So we can take those different areas that I started and try to think about how to cope according to these different aspects. So there's cognitive coping that we can engage in. That means that we can do everything to try to change our appraisals of a situation, remembering that the real risk of horrible outcomes is really low, that we think it's less than 3%, it may be much less than 3%, the better we respond and the better that our governments and healthcare systems are able to learn, that will go down even more. And to remember that also quarantine is about reducing risks for others who are at risk and keeping oneself safe. And so it's not about just being there for no reason, that it is trying to help benefit the rest of society by really keeping the risks as low as possible. Also keeping things in proportion, that while quarantine is not pleasant by any means, it's not a catastrophe, that at least in most places in the world, they are working at supplying sufficient resources and food and water and electricity, and that while it will be an unpleasant time that we need to get through, and we'll talk about how we can do more than just accepting, but accepting is one of those things, and how we relate to it is one thing, is another, but also keeping things in proportion is important. You know, already that really leads to actually a very important point is one of the ways to keep things in proportion is also making sure that you're getting reliable information. So if you're trying to seek out information about how to cope during these times, getting it from the CDC or from the Ministry of Health in whatever country you're in, and not looking for Facebook for random pieces of advice that may or may not be reliable, is probably a good way to go. But another thing about this is also taking these times as an opportunity, again, to try, the more that we change our stance toward what we're saying, instead of saying, I can't believe this is happening to me and how this is horrible and I'm never going to survive this, instead to be able to say, wow, this is an opportunity for the first time, and it looks like the month ahead for most people in the world There's ways that we can do things that we may not have been otherwise able to do. If you're more introverted, then catching up on movies and books. If you're more extroverted, then maybe catching up with friends via social media and phones, and actually having conversations with people that you haven't spoken to in a while. And I think this is really important to realize also, that I purposely said that it really depends on where you are on the spectrum of your personality in terms of introversion and extroversion, because it's also very important to realize there's not a one-size-fits-all advice here for how to cope with these things. We need to figure out what's best for ourselves and cope accordingly. And so I'm not going to give a single piece of advice that I think is for everybody. Hopefully some pieces of advice that I'm saying here will be helpful in certain ways for different people in different ways. Okay, so that's the cognitive coping piece. Now, another piece about the cognitive coping piece is that there are negative aspects of the way that we can think that can actually cause really what we might call thinking traps. What I mean particular is ruminating, or really brooding again and again about, why is this happening to me? Why now? Why am I stuck here? What will I do next year? How am I going to cope with it in the future? Right now, we're in such uncertain times that really we need to try to more just accept that this is. And when we have those thoughts of why me and why now and what am I going to do, we do know that it's not such a good idea to try to suppress those thoughts. But on the other hand, we don't need to engage with them fully either. We don't need to just keep asking them again and again. And what we can do is really just say, there's those why me thoughts again. There's those brooding thoughts. It makes sense. It's part of who I am, if that's how you tend to think. And to try to divide your attention and not invest in these thoughts, but to put them, instead of trying to invest your cognitive resources in these questions, to try to divest your cognitive resources in them and invest them in value-based thinking about what can you do right now to help yourself feel better, and what can you do to engage with other people. And I'll have some more ideas toward that. So we're not trying to completely cancel out these thoughts, but we're also trying to not invest them. So again, to divide our attention, if we're going to divide our attention, to put 90% of our cognitive resources and our emotional resources in productive types of thinking, and to let only 10% or even less go into this ruminative process. Another piece of a thinking trap is how we interpret things that are going on around us. The more that we misinterpret or catastrophically interpret our bodily sensations as signs of corona or worse, the more that we feel the need to keep checking our temperature and our breathing to make sure that we're not manifesting signs of corona, that's just going to lead us into negative, vicious cycles that we'll think we're having those signs whether or not we are. And so really you should be checking at most once a day. If you have a sign, then we'll get to that in a minute, then for sure you want to follow up. We don't want to avoid, but on the other hand, we don't want to overdo it. Okay, and that actually, I'll lead to that in a minute. Physiological coping is another way of coping in addition to cognitive coping. So what does it mean to physiological cope? It means different things for different people. There's not one technique that works for everybody. Nowadays, mindfulness meditation is a very hot, popular type of way of trying to deal with physiological coping through acceptance and meditation. But for some people that works, and for some people it doesn't. Other people, breathing works. Other people, relaxation. Other people, yoga. Other people, exercise. Other people, prayer. And it's not that only one of these works. Some people like 3 or 4 of these different things. Listening to music or playing music, engaging in art, doing also guided imagery. There are many different ways that people can do, taking a nice warm bath, doing all sorts of different things can help reduce our physiological stress. And behavioral coping is another really important part, which is linked back to some of those cognitive thinking traps that I was talking about before. We don't want to overly avoid things. So just because there's currently more and more people going into quarantine and that we're not supposed to be out in highly populated places. We need to follow the directives of the government, but if you're allowed to take a walk around the block, then you should do that. You shouldn't just stay locked in your house if that's not what is demanded by the government. You should keep active even if you are needing to be isolated at home in quarantine, doing exercise, whether it be stairs or whatever exercises work for you, but it's important to stay active. Also, we don't want to panic buy, that if you think that you're going to need to not be able to go out for 2 weeks, then buy 2 weeks worth of supplies and not 2 months worth of supplies. Over checking, as I was saying, not checking your body, not checking the news, not checking how other people are doing in a way that's really compulsive and not empathic. If we want to reach out to people and be with them, we want to be with them, not to calm ourselves, but to be actually engaged and affiliated with other people. Again, isolation is really one of the worst ways of trying to cope with these things. We want to make sure that you, even if you have to be at home, that you're in contact with people in different ways. In terms of the news, with the age of the internet and 24-hour news, we can easily be overwhelmed by the news. And so we want to control our news intake. You need to think about how often do you want to use look at the news and get information. I'm not saying to cut yourself off from the news, but a couple of times a day and not every 5 minutes to see if there's another person who's sick or another person who died, because those things are not going to be that helpful. It's also important to realize that part of avoidance at times for people who have more health anxiety is that they'll avoid seeking medical advice and seeking medical attention when it's necessary. So if one is experiencing true significant signs that the CDC or your ministries of health are saying are signs of corona, it is important to contact medical resources and to get medical advice. But if you're not having those signs, then not needing to seek just to seek relief. Another important way of coping is not just through our own behaviors, but also it's essential, like I said before, to not isolate. And so to be in touch with other people actively. I do think the age of technology is a great resource for us today in terms of that. We can text, call, write, blog, be in touch with people in so many different ways. But I think it's really important to differentiate between actively being in touch with people and passively trying to be in touch with people. There's a big difference between actively reaching out and engaging and mindlessly surfing and scrolling, looking at other people's Facebook pages and looking at other people's posts without engaging with them in any way. That passive engagement really can lead you to being sucked into the vortex of mindless scrolling that can lead to feelings of depression, detachment, and isolation. So with that, it's really important that if you are interested in scrolling and trying to spend some time, to keep time of how much time are you spending. There are all sorts of apps that you can put on nowadays. Some of them are actually to make restrictions so that after an hour, you stop using a certain website or a certain app, and others just will tell you how much time you're on so that you're at least aware and don't get into, again, lost in a way that will end up making you feel even worse as opposed to better. And emotional coping, of course, is really what all of this is all about in different ways. And so we need to accept that this is a stressful time. We're all stressed. And the way that we deal with that stress is really important. The more that we accept it, as opposed to say, oh, I can't feel stress. It's horrible that I feel stress. I'm not allowed to feel stress. The worst that we're going to do. There are studies showing that the way that our stance towards stress is actually much more what impacts us than the stress itself. And so we want to make sure that we are able to really accept that these are stressful times. Uncertainty itself is stressful, threat is stressful, the mix together is a very potent stressor. And most people in the world right now are feeling different levels of stress. And so it's normative, it's okay. We need to use that stress to help us keep ourselves safe and to do good things that can help us then feel like we're actually making a difference and helping be part of the solution as opposed to stuck and isolated and alone. So the more that we can make lemonade out of lemons as opposed to lemons out of lemonade, we want to make lemonade out of lemons. And think about what are the different ways that we can take this difficult, trying time and use it for good. I've heard of many different organizations and families who are increasing their acts of helping their neighbors or other people who are alone in order to try to really take this as an opportunity to increase their acts of chesed and tzedakah that they're doing. And we should all really be trying to do that more. It's also an opportunity to be expressing gratitude to people. There are times to reach out to people that you haven't been able to reach out to because you've been so busy in the rat race until now, and now you're kind of stuck at home more. And to reach out to an old teacher or a parent or a grandparent or someone that you haven't said things to that you've wanted to. This is not in order to make a last will and testament because you think that this is the end, but more to truly express gratitude. Which can also help counter the feelings of stress that we're feeling. And it would be greatly neglectful of me to not include some of the most basics that are probably some of the most important, even more than the other things that I've said until now. We need, I've already said exercise, but really the three of the most potent medicines we have for mental health today are exercise, eating healthy, and keeping good sleep routines and sleeping well. Those three factors contribute more to mental health than most anything else. So the more that we can, again, engage in exercise, make sure that you don't allow being at home to turn into unhealthy eating habits, eating a lot of junk food because you deserve it just because it's such a bad time. I'm not saying you should not eat anything at all that's not healthy, but to try to maintain a healthy diet, and also sleep routines, to not take this as an opportunity to just turn your days and nights around and sleep all day in order to try to pass time, and then you're ending up staying up all night. Daylight and sunlight are really good for your mood and good for reducing stress, and sleep itself contributes to both mood and anxiety. Lack of sleep, that is, the less sleep you get, the more anxious and depressed you can be. And so trying to keep a real sleep routine, going to sleep to bed at similar times, setting an alarm clock to wake up at a reasonable time too. I'm not saying you can't one day say you're gonna really, again, make lemonade out of lemons and sleep in for the first time because you're able to do so, but to not make it into a big pattern, because once you make it into a pattern, then you start to feel like you're just wasting away as opposed to trying to be engaged and more productive in different things. Also, if you are going to engage in screen time, which again, I think is a useful thing in these times, to make sure that it's mixed up with other types of activities as well, so you're not just 24/7 on different screens. And with all of this advice, if you're feeling out of control, there are a lot of different resources today that one can seek out even from one's own home. There's help online from online hotlines and chat, and also phone hotlines and chats. There are support groups that are popping up on all the different social networks of just people who are stuck at home for them to be able to talk to one another. I've heard of locally here in Israel, there are organizations now who are also they've opened up just to be able to have conversations with people who feel alone, and other types of things like that too. There are also a lot of resources and sources of information and treatment online nowadays. There's self-help information, a lot of information of things that you can do by yourself. Many of them are based on the different principles that I've just described today. There's internet-based treatments, in fact, that you can seek out in your local areas in order to see if there are people who will can help you either by video and phone treatments or by actually chat and providing tailored information to you in different ways. These are becoming very popular interventions around the world. It's things that we've developed here in Israel, but things have been developed over the last 20 years in terms of internet-based treatments. And that can also be a launching pad to, once the virus is under control, to then seek out more face-to-face treatment. If you're experiencing significant levels of anxiety and stress in a way that it's interfering and you feel like you're suffering, then cognitive behavioral treatments are the best evidence-based treatments for anxiety and stress. Data are pretty suggestive that they're equivalent to medication or other types of interventions, and they tend to be here and now, short-term, and quite effective for many people. And I will, in a minute, post some different links to different places that you can actually try to seek out more of those types of information. But to summarize for today, it's really all about how we approach this trying situation. It's trying, and we need to accept that this is a difficult situation. It's stressful, and yet it's also something that we can all manage. We need to try to understand with reliable information. We need to reach out and try to help others within our family and beyond. To keep healthy habits, eating, sleeping, and exercising. Again, to connect as much as possible as we can with other people, and to keep things in proportion. And here are just a few different links of places that can provide much more information and also resources for referrals for therapy, for different types of therapy, for anxiety and stress types of responses. And I'll now open the forum to questions. I'm opening now. Yeah, so so if you raise your hand, then I can select you to.
We have two raised hands. Do you see them?
Here we go. Okay.
Yeah.
The first one I'll choose is Michal Hennig. Go ahead. I can't hear you. Are we? Do I stop sharing screen? No, don't stop the video.
Oh, yeah.
Here, stop share. That's different than this.
Unmute.
Michal, I lost you, so I'm going to go to Glenn. Michal, raise your hand again if you're interested. Glenn Cohen? It's not letting me unmute.
Maybe you did.
Okay, Laurel Feldman? Maybe if you type in your question in chat, then I can answer it. Okay, Judith, I think you're on mute. If you turn yourself off mute, then you can speak.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. I just wanted to share with you that I've had a number of patients, I'm a clinical psychologist, I've had a number of patients who suddenly had with post-traumatic stress disorder, who suddenly came in with relapsing into severe panic attacks and didn't know why. They were like kind of just bewildered, like what's happening to me? I've been so much better. I've gone for a few months, and each one of them had a very, very different background. But when I started relating the symbolism of their trauma to what's happening with coronavirus, all of a sudden it was like a light bulb went on. They said, oh, I didn't realize that it was affecting me. Because I first asked them, how is it affecting you? And they said, oh, I'm calm, I'm fine. And then when I pointed out the relationship, they realized that was affecting them. That's what was causing it. And now then they felt more in control and like they would be able to handle it better.
Sure.
So,
When people have a history of trauma and now they're being threatened, the meaning of what it means to be in a potentially life-threatening situation is a clear trigger that again they need to learn how to reclaim control over their lives. So it makes a lot of sense that that can happen in those types of situations.
and especially that they were so unaware.
Right.
They had no idea that they thought it was completely separate thing, So.
Okay, well, thank you for your comment. I'm getting a lot of chat comments, so I'm gonna thank you, Judith.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
I'm gonna take one more by hand if I can. I'm not sure if I can take, Laura, you did, if you wanna, I see you did text me that, no, but you didn't ask the question. So please type your question. I see Laura Abrams has a question. What's the best way to talk to kids and help settle their concerns? So I think one piece of advice that's really important is to ask the kids what they already have heard and what they know, because a lot of kids get a lot of misinformation or also distort information that they've heard. And so it's important to ask them what have they heard and what do they know already about what's going on. And then it really depends on the age of the kid and their maturity to know how to address. So younger children, I think, just saying that, yes, there's a virus that's going around, but really we're safe. The truth is that it looks like for children and adolescents that it's less harmful. It's not that we should be encouraging them to go out and spread the virus at all, but that it really does seem like one can be reassuring to children, and to say that we're going to be okay. We're just doing our part to keep everyone else safe, to keep grandma and grandpa safe and other people safe. And as long as we just wash our hands and do what they're telling us to do, then we really hope that things are going to just pass. And for now, our job is to stay around and keep each other company. For younger kids, sometimes it's a good idea even to give them a task to maybe to call grandma every day, to check in with her, also to take care of their doll or their teddy bear and make sure that they're not getting the disease, the virus or the illness. So those are a couple of different ways, at least, to try to help settle their concerns. Jay has asked, what is trauma and phobia? So trauma is any kind of life-threatening situation that a person goes through. So again, right now we're kind of going through an international trauma of corona. Whether or not it will create real post-traumatic symptoms is a big question. I'm sure for some people it may, but for many people, people tend to be very resilient, and we will cope in the end. Phobias are a fear of any kind of situation. There's actually already been called coronaphobia, a new term for people who are extremely afraid of corona to the point that they're already quarantining themselves before they have any need to do so and are hoarding food and other types of issues like that. So that's what phobias and trauma are. Randy has asked, given that the corona affects elderly more than other demographics, any special advice has had to have difficult conversations with them? I think that the question about, we need to, as opposed to younger children where we want to adjust our conversations to the level in order to not overwhelm them with information. When we're talking about older adults, they're aware of the situation. And so really, I think that the issue is expressing how much we care about them, and because we care, how much we want to make sure that they're taking care of themselves and not exposing themselves to being at risk in different ways. And it does mean also then trying to increase our outreach to them even if it means just more by phone, and supplying them with the food and other necessities as much as we can to help them feel that they're being taken care of. Someone anonymous asked, how can we deal with both the virus and the economy and not being stressed? So again, I don't think it's actually realistic right now to think about not being stressed. It's true that the economy is going to be harmed. I'm not an economist, but it's, I think, obvious to everybody that it's going to take a long time for things to recover from this, and it's stressful. And I think a lot of what I've spoken about is how to deal with that stress as opposed to how to not be stressed. We have to accept that these are stressful times, and we have to use the different strategies that I've talked about to try to manage the stress as opposed to try to eliminate it. Okay, Laura, I see that you have written now that that your husband is immunosuppressed, and it's very stressful to you. So I think that it's stressful because he's very passive about trying to take care of himself. I am very sorry to hear that it sounds like it's a very difficult situation. And that really the best that you can do is to try to take care of him and yourself as much as possible. So trying to take whatever precautions you can for yourself and for him in a way that if he's less active in terms of taking care of himself, then seeing how willing he is for you to be taking the more active part. I hope that's a little bit helpful. Another question is, how can we resolve being torn between the feeling that you're overreacting to the situation, like being anxious about leaving the house, going to the supermarket and having play dates with other kids, and being rationally extra cautious in these times? You know, I think that these are, the balance here is not a simple one. And it really, part of it does entail knowing yourself a little bit. If you tend to be more reactive and tend to be more anxious than other people, and you see that other people are willing to go to the supermarket and have play dates, and that's permitted still, then you should do it, because it's important to be able to do that. Now, does it mean that you can go to the supermarket and wear a mask and wear gloves in order to feel a little better? I think in these times that's really a personal decision that's reasonable. So that's, I guess, where I would say to completely avoid and limit oneself beyond to the point that it could be harmful by not having sufficient supplies, or by really isolating your children. That's one thing, but by having them wash their hands before and during play dates, and wearing a mask and wearing gloves if you're going to go shopping, in order to not be contaminated from the shopping cart. Again, in normal times, I would say that that's not as reasonable, but in these times, it's reasonably in terms of the rational caution that we want to take in these times. Okay, I see that there are some more hands raised. Chen Avrami. Chen, I can hear, I think I've unmuted you.
Can you see the chat? In the chat?
I think your own, let me go back to chat. Chen, I think that your own microphone is muted. Oh, I see. Okay, there are a lot more from the chat. Yeah, let me go there. There will be a recording available of the talk for people. With teachers with students who need to continue to do their college work and may be experiencing anxiety. I think on the one hand that we have to understand that many of our students are coping with all sorts of things, not just their own anxiety, their family's anxiety, true threats to their economic situation. And we need to be as forgiving as possible and as understanding as possible in terms of the assignments we give to people. We should be giving them assignments that are manageable, and understand that some people may be even more in survival mode than in learning mode, and to be giving a little bit of room for those types of things. I do think that at the same time, you can also suggest to them many of the things that I've talked about earlier in my talk today, if it's more just dealing with the stress of the current situation. So in terms of psychological treatments right now, many psychotherapists are moving to online treatments, whether it be through Zoom or video conference of some way, and others are doing through chat or by phone. And those actually, there's plenty of data to suggest that those can really be helpful for many people. And so if in your area that things are being restricted, then that's definitely one way to go. And if you're not in an area that are restricted, then face-to-face treatments, keeping your distance still of 2 meters, 6 feet are possible, and then seek out experts according to the last slide that I showed everybody. Alana suggests that there's a excellent video. I haven't seen it, so I can't vouch for it, but from Z-Dog MD answering a 6th grader about questions about the coronavirus. Humor and laughter, of course, is always a good medicine, and it really depends on the person whether that kind of thing works for you. For sure, some people can laugh through this. I have one daughter who has lots of dark jokes already about corona that she's accumulated, and it definitely seems to be one way of coping that is reasonable in these stressful times, for sure.
You can suggest to raise their hands also. Some people with a microphone. Okay, so again, if you have a microphone activated, you're welcome to raise your hand. I don't know if there are more questions, then feel free to ask. The slides will be available via the via Mara. Okay, well, thank you all for joining and listening, and I hope this is helpful, and may we all manage our stress in these trying times.